Welcome to the STR Data Lab.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the STR Data Lab. I'm Jamie Lane, Chief Economist at AirDNA, and I'm joined here today by a good friend and colleague, Bram Gallagher, economist at AirDNA. Bram, thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Jamie. Good morning.
So we're sitting here the Tuesday after Labor Day, September 5th. How's your Labor Day?
It was great. It was very relaxing. Spent the weekend at home, actually.
That's awesome. I actually had an interesting Labor Day. We went up to the mountains, North Georgia mountains. It was a friend's house on the river. And what's happened recently is a beach is formed on the river right on their property. So we got to hang out at the beach in the mountains, which is, I feel like a fun industry question. Are you a beach or mountain guy? And the fact that and with our two young kids, 2 and 5, got to hang out on the beach while being up in the mountains, and it was great weather. Was the best of both worlds.
Yeah, we'll have to have a new location category for beach/mountain resorts.
Absolutely. So had you on today specifically because we wanted to talk about some of the risks out there to both the economy and the short-term rental industry. You've been a travel economist for coming up on a decade now, looking at and the impacts of the economy on overnight accommodations. You've got a sort of a keen sense of the impacts of different things on short-term rentals. So was hoping we could run through some of those potential headwinds given, and we've had so much good news on the demand side, and yes, some weakness on the occupancy side, and now some weakness on ADRs, but overall just still a relatively healthy short-term rental market. So, and what could potentially delay that? Does that sound good?
Absolutely. As a practitioner of the dismal science, it pays to look at the negatives every once in a while.
Yeah. So, and we don't want this to come off as a negative episode, but it's meant to be one that, what are the things that we're thinking about today that might cause things to not be as strong as they have been as we look out over the back half of 2023 and into 2024.
Right, events to look out for.
Yeah, and we're going to start maybe one that's a little bit unpredictable, but impactful nonetheless, especially with the recent sort of Hurricane Idalia in Florida. So maybe I could start with Bram. And one, what have we seen in Hurricane Idalia and its impact? I know, and thoughts with everyone down there. There were some areas that were really impacted, like Cedar Key and other areas in the Panhandle as it came through. But we have sort of studied Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Ian in the past. But just overall, what have we seen in terms of hurricane impact, and what sort of risk is that for the short-term rental sector?
Right, that's a great question, Jamie. And Hurricane Idalia, it was a deadly hurricane. But when we look at it compared to those two previous storms that you talked about, Hurricane Michael and Ian, the effect is much less pronounced on the overnight stays and tourism sector because of, well, one, the strength of the hurricane was a Category 3, and Hurricane Michael was a Category 5. Ian was a strong 4. But also, I think primarily it was the area it hit was not as densely populated and as developed as some of the places that have been hit in the past. And also, luckily, it was a pretty swift-moving storm, so we didn't see as much flooding with Hurricane Idalia. So that was fortunate. Looking at some previous, I've been looking at these hurricanes for a long time. Me and my family, we go down to Panama City Beach every year. It's our yearly annual vacation spot. And I always have to say, except when Hurricane Michael hit, then we had to go to Destin. But it had a profound effect on a very localized area, Michael. So it struck Mexico Beach and Panama City Beach, I think primarily, and that was where we saw a lot of the effects. But even looking at that small area, Hurricane Michael, we saw Mexico Beach its short-term rental supply was reduced by about 85%. So completely gone, essentially. Panama City Beach, which is adjacent to it, saw about a 10% decline in the supply being offered, and it was able to recover the very next season. So, it's with these storms. Sometimes the effects can be very highly localized. Hurricane Ian, on the other hand, now it was a slightly weaker storm when it hit, but because of the way that it moves through the state and the flooding, the extensive damage it caused to a lot of the very densely developed areas, Cape Coral. Also, we see some effects in Lakeland, Winter Haven, and that's been a lot slower to recover. So it was a bigger area. There was a profound effect, and we're still seeing the recovery from that. In fact, I believe the supply went down about a quarter, and it's still down by about 20% in Cape Coral, which was, I think, the most severely impacted.
And when we look at sort of storms in the past, how long does it typically I would think we sort of go through phases, right? And there's the initial phase after the hurricane where areas that sort of saw significant devastation, obviously they're going to see supply drops, and we're going to see maybe competing factors in terms of demand and some displaced residents needing temporary housing, but also tourists avoiding that area because of the damage. And then we sort of move on to the next phase, which is sort of that in between time where maybe tourists aren't yet back. Residents are well on their way to rebuilding, finding more permanent housing, and then you sort of and move on to the sort of long course of recovery of getting tourists to and consider that location again and come back. So as you've been sort of studying this, sort of, is it years to recover? Is it in a season or two broadly? And what do you see there?
The answer to that question, it varies a lot, I think, by location. So
Mhm.
it's your favorite answer. It depends. Um, so, as I was saying, like Panama City Beach, it was able to recover very, very quickly. So, yeah, so the cycle goes about 3 months around the disaster. You might see slightly elevated occupancy just because of displacement. That's something that we observe in wildfires as well, hurricanes, all kinds of natural disasters. And then for Panama City Beach, it was only about 6 months to a year. We had pretty much full recovery. I think that was aided by the fact that we do have that it's a really strong sort of tourist economy down there, and they were cognizant of that, and a lot of the redevelopment was looking towards being able to accommodate that. And when we look at Hurricane Ian, these are population centers too. We've got short-term rentals. Some of these are vacation homes, but a lot of these are also second homes and homes that people are and sometimes staying in as well parts of the year. And that takes a little bit longer, I think, to build back. And that's what we've seen in Cape Coral, is that even a year later, we're still down 20%. I'm thinking it could take several more years to completely recover that market. Again, just because of the population that actually lives there that is working to get back to where they were. Another thing to consider and think about with these hurricanes as well is, as climate change maybe intensifies hurricanes and flooding, this has effects on recovery as well that I think that we've seen in Cape Coral and other areas. Insurance becomes more expensive, flood insurance, homeowners insurance. Sometimes what we've seen is some insurers have actually left some of these markets because of that, and that adds significant hurdles to building back after these disasters, and can, I think, greatly extend the time horizon that we're thinking about.
That's great. And something while we were talking, I was sort of looking at the data for the Cape Coral, Fort Myers area, and it was one as you said, still seeing the recovery, but and it actually really aligns with the areas that see the biggest decline in listings, i.e., the areas that were impacted the most directly by the hurricane, still seeing falling occupancies. So people still broadly avoiding those areas as they rebuild and recover. and the areas that didn't see major destruction, maybe taking on some of the people that are still wanting to travel to that area and actually seeing and further occupancy gains. So can sort of divide a market and areas that see destruction versus don't, which and sort of plays into the different dynamics you see when a hurricane hits an area.
True. A lot of this is, repeat business as well. So when you interrupt that cycle, that can make it difficult. If people move to a different area or they take their vacation to a different area, they may like that and stay there, especially if those properties aren't available for one or more seasons.
Yeah. So moving on to maybe an impact that is a bit more predictable, especially given the political environment we've been in, is the impact of government shutdown. So as we sit here today in early September, the fiscal year will end at the end of the month. We still do not have a budget agreement, which means there could potentially be a government shutdown if we do not see either a budget signed or a continuing budget agreement passed. But this is something we have seen before, similar to hurricanes. During the Trump presidency, we did see a shutdown that lasted actually for a significant period of time, 35 days. So as we think about a government shutdown, what are the risks out there for short-term rental, either investors or operators?
Sure. Yeah. The first thing that I was looking at when we were talking about government shutdowns are, what are the direct effects? If we look at, say, Washington, D.C., people are going to be less likely to travel there if the government's shut down. You've got a lot of furloughed employees. The other thing that I was looking at, of course, were some of the services that were affected, like national parks that had closed or had partially closed because of the shutdown. So those effects can be localized. It's difficult to see in our data the negative impacts of that 2018-19 shutdown in a lot of these areas adjacent to parks. And one of the reasons is a lot of the parks were at least partially open. It was also during January, so this is not necessarily peak season for places like Smoky Mountains, which had its roads open anyway. There was definitely some negative impact in DC. We saw that in the hotel market as well back in 2018-19. But a broader impact is the government shutdown. It restricts a lot of spending. So in essence, it acts as sort of a fiscal brake on the economy. It could contribute negatively to GDP growth. And I think this is especially risky right now. I know as economists have been talking about recession fears and downturns for a long time. I think people are now just shrugging us off. And that's when economists, when you stop paying attention to them, that's when economists are most dangerous. Because we're actually starting to see a little bit of turning in the economy. So unemployment, which had been really low, historically low, 3.3%. Now, when I was going in undergraduate studying economics, 5% was considered the natural unemployment rate. So 3.3, that was unheard of. That was serious overheating territory. I think it's moved down a little bit since then, so that now we're raised up to about 3.8, and I think if we got to 4%, that would satisfy the Fed as to a natural unemployment, essentially. So we're getting there. We're edging up unemployment. Wage growth has slowed down a bit. I think the Fed would like to see it slow down a little bit more, but it's already starting to slow. So whenever you have wages that increase more quickly than productivity, you've got all these incomes that are chasing, larger incomes chasing the sort of the same amount of goods. You have that inflationary pressure. So that is a measure that they're looking at. So that's sort of tailing off. We saw very strong consumption in July. However, a lot of that was, again, those strong balance sheets that we saw post-COVID when we were all stuck in our houses, got a little stimulus check and nothing to spend it on. We paid down some debt. So, that really helped our wealth position, but, we're digging into that in July. So I think we're at a position where we're more likely to be headed into this downturn. Oxford Economics says that some sectors are already there. They call it a rolling recession. Sector by sector, we'll see. Also, another pressure is student loan repayments are going to start up next month as well. And I've heard a lot of downplaying of that in various forums, but I think that could have a real effect on people's perception of their wealth position and therefore their consumption spending, how freely they're going to be able to spend. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And then we're going to have a fiscal break, which could exert a negative influence on the GDP. And that could further exacerbate the situation, maybe make a mild recession more severe.
Bram, you're depressing me.
Well, the sunny part of that is that, even if we were to have a more severe recession, our unemployment rate is still below what I think the natural rate of unemployment is. So we've still got a little bit of leeway there. And I think travel demand, of all the different products and consumer goods that people can have, I think travel demand is going to prove out to be pretty durable. With the low unemployment, just the great labor numbers that we've seen for the last year, I think that the travel is going to be maybe less affected than some other sectors. Durable goods, housing certainly is extremely expensive and difficult right now with the interest rates being where they are.
So when you mentioned sort of Oxford's rolling recession, how do you sort of think about short-term rentals in that, and maybe travel in general? Is that the rolling recession that short and travel's had is already past us, i.e., and COVID was a massive recession for travel. We came back through that, and other sectors are now seeing, and that maybe saw a big uptick in demand during the pandemic, are now coming off of it and seeing a subsequent recession. So is sort of Oxford or our economists in general expecting and declines in sort of travel demand over the back half of the year into 2024?
No, I don't think that they are. They're not forecasting travel in particular to be sort of the next sector to fall into recession. I think it's, broadly services. We're starting to see a little bit of signs of weakness there. And then manufacturing, maybe it's already sort of seen a downturn, and it might be coming out of that at some point. But you're right. We had a pretty extended period of time where we had below normal travel levels.
And then you also mentioned sort of student loan repayments. This is one that I'm hearing a lot of chatter around on the impact, especially around consumer spending. You've got Gen Z, millennials, maybe even still some boomers with student loans that they're going to have to start repaying, upwards of $300 a month on average in terms of payments. And that could be a direct hit on maybe on spending that people were putting towards discretionary sort of travel services, going out for dinners. And now they're all of a sudden going to have to start repaying those loans come next month. And that could be a big negative hit on the consumer spending side. Are you sort of following that or expect that to happen?
Yes, I am. And I'm a little more, I think, bearish about that than some economists. We often assume that people are going to be perfectly rational and they're going to look at their lifetime income and the value of all their assets objectively. But I think there's a lot of research, too, that says that people are debt averse. They don't like thinking about big debts that they've got. And I think, having the student loan pause was really a positive, uplifting boon for a lot of people that had that extra money that they could spend, month after month. It allowed them to maybe compartmentalize some of that student loan debt as, maybe something we'll deal with later. So once those payments resume, I've got to factor this into my budget. I got to look at my wealth picture now in terms of all my liabilities versus my assets. So I think that, that could have a really profound psychological effect on consumption spending. And then if that happens, we've got, of course, multiplier effects. If we're not going to be out there doing that consumption spending, there's all the auxiliary stimulus, I guess, that occurs because of that economic activity that will not happen.
But Bram, what about the point that the government has instructed the credit agencies not to actually report people that aren't paying their student loans? So is anyone actually going to start paying these loans?
Oh, wow. Let me write that down. That seems like a
at least for the first year, right now,
economic strategy.
Yeah. And if there's not going to be penalty for not paying, and is anyone going to pay?
That's kind of uncharted territory. I think most people, by and large, they'll follow the letter of the law. They'll honor their commitments. They've certainly been making a lot of noise about it in the headlines lately. Hey, these are starting up again. You really got to pay these. So I think a lot of people will. So I mean, it's going to have an effect. Maybe not necessarily right in October, because there is a transitional forbearance period for people switching to the new SAVE program. But after that, in the new year, I think this reality is going to hit home for a lot of people.
All right. So, and we've talked about and government shutdown, hurricanes, student loan repayment, sort of the risk to the economy, this sort of rolling recession that Oxford's been talking about. One of the other things that's sort of top of mind, sort of negative headlines towards the industry is regulation. And specifically, we have today new regulation going into effect in New York, where Airbnb is going to start removing listings, blocking future bookings for properties that aren't registered with the city and do not sort of meet the law for the new law in New York, sort of restricting severely how short-term rentals can operate in the city. I know you've done lot of research on regulation. I can talk a little bit about and what we expect to happen, sort of the makeup of the city. But maybe just kicking off, and overall, what do we see in terms of regulation and its longer term impact on a market? And do we typically see a big drop off in listings? Do we typically see those listings come back? And how does that impact the performance of short term rentals in a market?
Yeah, sure. I had trouble believing it, but I kept searching on Airbnb today for single rooms in New York City, and sure enough, there's only about 180 some odd listings for next week. So yeah, as far as regulation goes, they are effective. Regulations can be very effective at limiting the short-term rental supply, and sometimes very sharply so. We've seen there's some really severe overseas examples. For Amsterdam is a good one, for instance, where you can just see the number just shoot down as regulations take effect. Here in the U.S., we've had a little bit of a lighter touch in most places than some of our European counterparts. But I think the prevailing theme is that when you've got these really strict regulations, it's easier to keep renting if you've had a rental for a long period of time, but it's difficult to re-enter the market. So we had COVID-19 exert this terrific one-time impact on listings everywhere. And most places were able to recover, but you've got places with heavy regulation like San Francisco, Boston, New York in the U.S., and we're still well below where we were before the pandemic. Some of these places were starting to make something of a comeback. New York is one of those that it had some upward trajectory, but it looks like with the renewed enforcement, this may be slowed down again.
Yeah, and New York is one of the more interesting markets out there, just given all the regulations that were around and have been around for a long time. New York was, and really Airbnb's first major market that they pushed heavily into, and was one of the fastest growing from the beginning. As of today, or as of yesterday, there were 47,000 listings in the city. But unlike most markets, we'd already seen a transition of the supply. So in New York, 52% of the listings, 53%, were for 30-day or longer stays. And that's a higher percent than any other market in the US in terms of the percent of stays that were only for mid or long-term rentals.
And then that's because under the New York regulations, those are the permissible Airbnb or short-term rental units.
Absolutely. We also see almost 20,000 of the 47,000 listings being private and shared room. So rooms where the host are units where the host is present. And there's some overlap there between the two, but broadly, the market has already shifted towards supply that is going to be legal under the new regulation. We do see that New York is having a hard time getting all the private and shared rooms registered. I think I read that there had been 3,000 plus applications submitted, and only a couple hundred had actually been approved. So it may take some time to get all these units back that should be legal under the new regulations, but not going to be ready and available sort of day one, which unfortunately will impact the earning potential for a lot of people that probably and rely on short-term rentals to pay bills, make ends meet. And then sort of we dug into the data to find of the short-term rentals that are more than likely now not illegal under the law, not able to be registered or operated, sort of 30-day or less days and entire home units with significant and booking activity. So over 20 reviews, and we're seeing them booked regularly, available full time, more than 180 days. It's only about 4,000 listings. And those are generating almost half of the revenue that we see in the overall market. So, of the 47,000 listings, government's really what it appears to be is going after this sort of core group of only 4,000 listings. A lot of the headlines were sort of really touting this sort of 40,000 listings illegal, which is just not the case. Very small percent, 4,000 listings. There's over 3.5 million housing units in the city. I think almost 300,000 of those vacant. So a lot of unused housing, a lot of luxury condos, a lot of sort of units that could be going to long-term housing that aren't. And short-term rentals have really been the scapegoat here. And I think unfortunate to see, unfortunate for these people that were operating these units that more than likely have to get taken down and find other ways to operate their businesses.
Right. Yeah. A couple of these things stand out to me. One, the delay in the processing of the applications is very unfortunate, right? That's what the Airbnb lawsuit was originally about, is difficulty in the registration process. And that case was dismissed, but it seems like we're seeing some of that play out, actually. I hope they get it straightened out. I know that New York has got it's strong December and January for New Year's and the holidays. So, I hope we'll be able to go up and be able to stay and go ice skating. But yeah, and there's that other idea, and this is something that I've been doing a lot of research in, the housing affordability argument, which I think is the main argument in New York City. In fact, I think it's the main argument for most of these, very restrictive regulations that they come into play, is that, housing is very difficult to afford in New York. So let's get rid of Airbnb, and then housing will be plentiful again, and we'll be able to get the prices down. But, as you say, we've got 4,000 essentially very active units. There are other units, but, if they're occupied by the owner, for some points in the year, it probably isn't going to be able to be transferred. But you've got these 4,000 units, and are they going to be affordable? Or are we going to see that statistic, the vacant homes, where it was 353,000 vacant units, now it's 357,000 vacant units. You've got less tax revenue, you've got less tourism, you'd have sort of the benefits that brings, the economic benefits, those will be gone, but we won't actually see really any impact at all on the housing market. Housing affordability has certainly been an issue in New York City before Airbnb, and with this, I really am strained to see any measurable impact that this is going to have on housing affordability moving forward.
Well, on that positive note, maybe we'll wrap it up.
Well, one thing I would say though is that regulations can be changed, and if this is the case, we have a couple of years, and wow, it looks like housing is still unaffordable in New York. Maybe we can roll back some of this onerous regulation that was maybe put in place under bad premises.
And that's where we sort of need listeners to and show up, push back, help fight these regulations, help our leaders in these cities understand all the benefits that short-term rentals do provide these cities, guests, bringing tourists into a destination that can bring and very positive long-term benefits, which we all see. So, Bram, thank you so much for joining today. Are there any sort of parting thoughts, any things else you're watching over these next couple months that you'd like to share with the users?
Sure. Yeah. The one thing that I would say is that this short-term rental industry is incredibly strong right now. We've talked about a lot of negatives today, but historically, I think a lot of these are pretty minor concerns. Some of the things that this industry has weathered, whether it's COVID, difficult regulations in the past, it's in a very strong position today. July, we saw the most demand in the U.S. that we've seen in any month for short-term rentals. The share of the overnight economy, I heard you talking with Isaac the other day about that. It's back up to really high levels. So, short-term rental industry, I believe, is going to be a permanent fixture in overnight stays and accommodations hospitality moving forward. These are just some of the things that maybe you should keep in mind while you're operating. Things that you can prepare for, plan for moving forward to make sure that your operation is running as smoothly as it can.
Well, thank you for sort of wrapping it up on a positive note. And with that, thank you, listeners. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time.